Hello, and welcome to another session of the Game Mechanics, where today we're going to be talking about narrative design principles, and we're talking about one of my favorite people in the world, Sean Stewart, who, God, it's been over 25 years now that I've been working with Sean, and every time I do, it is nothing but joy. We met originally introduced by Neil Stevenson, which is a great way to meet somebody who's going to be one of your best friends, is through a world famous author who was introducing me to an author that he had enormous respect for, which was Sean. And Sean had done a great series of really deep and beautiful novels, but he knew that Sean was a gamer at heart, and the project we were working on would later become called The Beast for Steven Spielberg's film. And Kathleen Kennedy introduced me to Neil Stevenson. Neil Stevenson introduced me to Sean Stewart, and the rest has been a 25-year love affair. So, Sean, I will let you kind of do a little intro of yourself, and then we'll dive into the meat.
Okay. Well, in this context, I guess the first thing to say is that I started playing RPGs 5 years before the kids in Stranger Things. So not as long ago as you, but quite a while.
I remember in our first meeting, you said, if you're looking for a guy who rewrote the damage tables in Empire of the Petal Throne, I'm your man. And there was like 12 people on the planet besides me and you who remember that game. You know,
that's right. It was, if you're looking for someone who's played Empires of the Petal Throne with the RuneQuest damage tables, that would be me. Just by memory. And you laughed and said, there may not be 10 people in Seattle who understand that sentence, but I am one of them. The setup for this should be, by the way, you left out your question to me, which was, by any chance, do you know what a role-playing game is? So I felt like the mythical person who gets their six-figure job because of their Donkey Kong score. It was unexpected. So I started there, put myself through college, among other things, writing murder mystery dinner theater and LARPs, running LARPs. But then I decided that I would, needed a serious, sober, money-making career and had to put away childish things and become a freelance science fiction novelist. It shows that my grasp of how business works was not strong. So I did that for quite a while and published a bunch of books, including running across, as you say, Neil Stevenson. And then I was bitten by a radioactive Weisman. And this second stage of my career, starting with with The Beast, the first alternate reality game. And you and I have worked on a whole bunch of projects. And then the not Jordan stuff I've done includes working at Xbox Entertainment Studio, trying to think what interactive television will be. Got that gig, had a startup doing interactive TV stuff, and won an Emmy in a category whose name was changing every single year because I couldn't figure out what to call it. But it's kind of the interactive TV thing. Worked at Magic Leap doing XR stuff, which might come up later in this conversation. And then a whole bunch of other things, interactive stage plays, and I'm currently working at a startup using AI to create deep character interactions in what is in other ways a lot like an ARG, but an ARG where a canned ARG where you can speak to characters who have fairly deep and responsive.
don't forget your tour at Disney Imagineering.
And yeah, and I think I am officially allowed to say that I worked on Story for Galactic Star Cruiser, which was an amazingly fun time and one of the coolest experiences I've ever had a chance to walk through. And I wasn't allowed to tell anyone about it for 4 years. And then I could finally tell the guys that I had been running LARPs with in 1985. You'll never guess. So
Yes, yeah, that project was a love-hate thing for me. So I love starting it, and then I hated that I didn't get to participate in the actual building of it. But such is the divisions of large organizations as things move from R&D to production. Anyway, so let's dive into the subject. So the goal here is for us to talk about today narrative design principles, and especially with a light from a point of view of people starting their own game design, starting their own world building, and to give them what tips of the tricks and painful things they can avoid. Um, so maybe let's start with some definitions. So, like, what do we mean by narrative design versus game writing, for instance?
well, based on your notes, I'm going to say narrative design is all the ways you think about delivering a story and story world. Um, so it's not necessarily what you write. It's not the individual lines of dialogue or even characters, but the entire methodology by which this interactive project is going to be situated in story and deliver story. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. I view it as kind of strategy versus tactics, right?
Mm.
The narrative design is overall how does the story of the game impact the play of the game and vice versa, right? And what is the kind of overall mechanics of how story and game interact, right? And then the tactics are okay. Now let's get down to individual lines of dialogue and flows of specific conversations and so on. But it's establishing that high level strategy, I think, which is to me what really means, and is often I think sometimes doesn't get as much discussion or exploration in the beginning of the experience.
I think it's really important to, I mean, one of the things you have to come to grips with early, I think, is the fact that story and game don't like each other. They operate, uh, a, a game is by its nature replayable, and a story is by its nature not. And you can do a whole bunch of accommodations to make those two things work together. Thank God, or I'd have no job. Um, but understanding that very fundamental difference between a thing that is infinite in principle and a thing that is highly finite in principle, um, and understanding how you're going to make peace with that, I think is uh, a very fundamental first step that you have to take. And the second thing I would say, as someone, I'm assuming that most of the people who are watching this come from the perspective of uh, people with a lot of game design experience or people who are interested in games, knew a lot about games. For someone who tuned into this particular episode because they think of themselves as more the story guy, I just you guys almost certainly know this, but speaking as someone who cut his teeth as a novelist, I've brought a lot of writers in on these kinds of projects, and it's very important that they understand that the game loop must come first. That in interactive, the the story can inspire you. It might even been your first idea, but ultimately, in the ballroom dance of things, gameplay is the gentleman who proposes the step. Um, Story beautifully accommodates that whenever possible. And you need to let go of the idea that this will be like a movie or like a novel. And one of the places you can see this most clearly, just harkening back to Magic Leap and XR stuff, is anyone out there who's messed around with VR, without question, the worst VR thing you ever did was made by someone with a film degree because they come at it with, this is a technology that will make my vision more awesome. And the first thing the player does is like, oh, what's over there?
Yeah, I think that's the core of it, which is the sense of whereas who has control, right? in linear media, novels, film, so on, the writer or the showrunner or the director, depending upon which medium you're in, has directorial control, right? They're the ones who are really being able to sculpt the experience for the audience, and you're on the journey, but you're not in control of it. When you go to a game, now part of the contract with a game player is that you're ceding control, some or all control, to the game player. And that means you have to approach it from a very different perspective in terms of how your storytelling works, right? As you said, right? If you're viewing it as, oh, I'm just going to tell my story, that's not going to work because it's got to be the player's story. And I think that's actually one of the key things that's worth discussing, because I view, when I talk to people about storytelling and gaming, there are different tiers of storytelling, right? There is the story you intended to tell through gameplay. There is a story that the player created from gameplay, and there's the story that the player tells others about their gameplay, right? And you want to design for each of those storytelling arcs.
100%. Could not agree more. That one of the things that, and I might even add one more because I come from the school of Jordan Weisman, which, or rather, the just emphasizing, underlining that last part. The story tells others, and more generally, the social interaction between players or between a player and an audience or a friend or whatever is super important. So one of the things that when I'm introducing, like right now at the doing this AI thing, I'm working with a guy who's super fun and smart, and his background is as a TV showrunner. Great writer, and he's been very adaptable, but just making sure you understand, let's have a beautiful idea about a character in a scene, but let's also consciously try to make sure that we are creating a moment that a player is going to turn around and say, and then I said this and that happened, or then I did this, or what is the hero moment or the unexpected thing or the way that they get to see themselves, ideally up on the Jumbotron. I often talk about baseball games for some reason when I'm talking to writers new to the space.
You're one of the few geeks that are really a sports fan. I mean, so yeah, often you'll use a sports analogy, and I'm like, what sport was that again?
In this case, you'll follow this fairly clearly, that no matter how great a baseball game is, if they showed you on the Jumbotron in the sixth inning, what's the first thing you say when you get home?
Yes.
Never, hey, there was a great double play in the second inning. Like, no, it's like I was on the big TV. And so remembering that in interactive, how do we put the player on the big TV and give them a memorable moment?
I agree. Yeah, and that's within the context of a single player game or a multiplayer game or the community that forms around any game, right? Giving them that feedback, that moment of what, like when we did the BattleTech centers and the virtual world centers back in the 90s, the term I used was local fame, right? I always used to say, and I don't know if everybody will get this reference anymore, because there was an old TV show called Cheers. And whenever Norm walked into the bar, the entire bar said, "Hi, Norm." And it's like, that's what we want as humans. We want that recognition. We want that feedback. And whether it comes within the context of the game, or within the context of single player, multiplayer, or from the community around the game, having that opportunity is incredibly powerful, right? Seeing your actions are reflected in the world, even in a single player game, right? When you perform an act of charity to somebody, and then you see that ripple through the world and it comes back to you, right? That has enormous emotional impact, even if it didn't up your stats or it didn't change, save the world, right? Just seeing that you had an impact on the world and the characters of the world. I mean, to me, that's one of the great things you're trying to always do in a good narrative design.
I agree completely. And also I want to, I've taken to, in my sort of private conversation, I less and less use the words interactive story and more use the words responsive story.
Yeah,
Uh,
or emergent. Yeah.
because um, interactive always assumes that the player has agency, and what agency means in most people's heads is I do something and the story branches. But the example you gave right now, I tossed a silver piece to a beggar on the street who thanked me for it, does not necessitate a branch. Just that later someone says, "Oh, I heard you're a good guy." I don't have to say the ship burns or the castle is stormed based on that, right? I just have to have a mechanism. And in fact, in terms of narrative design, I like to look for lots of places to give responsiveness without necessarily branching plot.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a second, because that is one of the classic kind of early in your career design moments, is when you start to you start to branch your story for every action, and you end up with these trees that are, you know, just thousands of branches deep, and they're also unplayable in the sense that, players go through their particular branch. And so we always used to use the analogy of how much film was on the cutting room floor, right? You've created such an incredible amount of content which never gets seen by an individual player. Now, in the Gestalt, if you're lucky enough to have a large community, then members of those communities will go down different branches and they will have that fun of comparing their experiences, which has enormous value, but it also has enormous production costs associated with it.
I mean, I'm confident that it was you who first said, listen, the math of this is very straightforward. Every time you branch, you're making 2x content for half as many people. So you don't have to do that very many times to realize, oh my God, I'm spending an enormous amount of effort on events or incidents or props or costumes or sets or actions that are being seen every single time by a smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller number of people. What the hell am I thinking?
Well, and this takes you back I mean, to your very initial statement, right? A great story is very efficient, it's linear, right? There's no branching at all. It's completely, 100% of the content gets seen by the audience, right? And then you've got, okay, but there's no agency there. There's no reflectivity there, right? There's no kind of meaningful choices. So then all of game design and narrative game design is finding that balance between kind of efficiency of production, realism of production, and providing, the greatest possible actual agency with the illusion of even more agency.
Right. I would also, one thing that I've done a lot is you can make a lot of hay with how. Like, the player's got to get through this door. There's a door, there's someone at the door, and the player's got to get through it. You don't have to spend a lot of time on what if the player decides not to go through the door. You can let
Right.
You can say, no, the story is you're going to get through that door. Are you going to fight the guy? Are you going to bribe the guy? Are you going to arrange a distraction? Are you going to maybe the only way through is to talk your way through, and you've got to just decide it's bully or bribe or coax or make an appeal to charity. These are all very story forward things. They're very rich in character, but they require much less in the way of asset production.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, words are the cheapest thing you can come up with, but but even they carry cost, right? In terms of testing and making sure that the expectations that you've set through the words can be lived up to.
Agreed.
Yeah, I think I was going to say, building on that for a second, I think one of the key things in mechanical design and in narrative design and the merging thereof, um, is setting expectations, right? Having players understand kind of what are the limits of how do they interact with the world, and what are the inherent constraints with their interaction with the world. And I think if those are set out in a way that is clear to the player, then they don't chaff against them as much, right? Whereas if you kind of start by saying, "Oh, you can do anything," well, you never can do anything, right? So you're always going to be encountering those kind of invisible bumpers. But I think if you can kind of more narratively and mechanically set those expectations in the beginning of the game, it becomes easier for you and the player.
Yeah, I think you're really right. And there can be some art to that expectation setting. So let's talk about something that we worked on that was possibly a mistake, but has some useful lessons. We've referenced a couple of times the Beast, the first ARG, and not present on this screen, but incredibly important in that was the designer Elon Lee, now of Exploding Kittens. Um, and the thing to know about Elon at this time in his life is he had been a teenage hacker. Like he'd been the guy who, when the radio station says, we'll have a pair of tickets to this concert for caller number 25, would take over the trunk line and then dial 25 times until he got his tickets. Um, so he went at that game with that ethos, knowing that he was going to be, he was the sort of player who would constantly test the edges and expecting that there would be players who would constantly test the edges. This was a game in which the gameplay involved going out and visiting real websites and scanning them for stories and clues and stuff like that. And one of the things about every website in the world is that it has the same basic format of identification in the DNS server, the domain name server. Except Elon had a buddy who worked at the DNS server and got our websites to have a different one that said that they were indeed in the year 2142. So even when the hacker guys were like just screwing around, when they found that, it wasn't like they could do anything to it, but they did feel seen. It's like, yeah, I know you're there. We're in a dance together. I am showing you, you can't go any further, but I see you. So there's some real art to the way you can set those expectation guidelines to make people feel seen. Um,
Yeah. I mean, the Beast was interesting on many fronts, right? I mean, the premise that I started with was right. We need to design something we think is impossible to solve because we were betting on the fact that there was going to be this what we call the hive mind, this collective that would solve it. So and we were doing it in secret, right? No one knew who we were. And one of the first challenges was that somebody came out and pretended to be us and told the audience as us, you're doing it wrong. You shouldn't be collaborating. You should be trying to solve this as individuals, right? And we faced that first kind of challenge. Like, well, do we go out and correct them and say, no, that's not true. We wanted you to do it. Or and so internally we were talking about this. We said, no, if we believe in our premise that this hive mind is capable of any puzzle solving, then they will solve the puzzle that's a fake. And they did, right? Within the next day. Yeah, they debunked
I,
that and
I
realized
had
that they knew the
forgotten
ground.
that, but you're absolutely right.
So it's I mean, that's kind of an example of, build your mechanics and then trust your mechanics, right? And stick with them throughout the design.
And if you look at the first 1,000 comments on that game, it's extraordinary how many of them is the players trying to figure out the rules. Is this fair? Is this legal? Can we do this? Are we supposed to do this? Are we encouraged? Are we forbidden? Like, it was interesting. People who would, under normal circumstances, push really hard and try to break the game when they know how the game was supposed to work were actually quite delicate. And later on, I met like a hacker who had completely brute forced one of the sites, but wasn't sure whether that was allowed or not, so hadn't told anyone what he found.
Right.
Oh.
Um, so I want to kind of vector a little bit. It definitely aligns with the ARG stuff, but also I think really applies to all of the kind of more traditional video games, which is the kind of game equivalent of the show don't say in film,
Mm.
right? which is, play, don't display,
Yeah.
um, in games, right? Walls of text or big soliloquies from characters are not really what the player signed up for, right? They need to be the one well, I mean, ideally you want them to be able to discover your narrative through play as opposed to being told your narrative through more linear formats. Any particular examples of successes or failures that you've encountered for that?
Well, I mean, one of the ones that we talk about and that I think is foundational for anyone who wants to do really story forward work um, is the mist model, right? Where I have a single linear story that I want to deliver, and I do not want to make a ton of branching. So I split the game into there is a linear story, but you are going to explore and collect. And the how you do that and the order you do that, that mechanic is clearly defined and has lots of agency to it. Um, but the story is fixed. So, and which was, something you brought to those early ARGs is this idea story is theology. There's one pot, we break the pot, and it's up to the players to find it and put it back together again. And I think that mechanic, that realizing that you can have a very strong story and a very strong mechanic, but the story doesn't have to be reactive to the mechanic sometimes. It can, but it doesn't have to be. And just realizing that fundamental exploration and collection of a single narrative. It's something that I think, for example, is going to be really useful in VR or XR work. They don't have the kind of complete control and rapid millisecond response that a console video game does. In fact, a lot of the fun of those VR environments or an XR environment where it's your own apartment that you're looking around in is to explore and find things. So this kind of mist, an example, for instance, of porting the mist mechanic into a story that you might play with an XR would be the Borrowers, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. You and I've talked about that one many times. Yeah. Yeah.
Or that will apply to a lot of standard RPGs as well, in some senses, is you have a lot of, there are all kinds of stories in the castle, but where in the castle you go and how you find them is up to you.
And I think, in a classic RPG, but I think it's true in any kind of game, right? This kind of environmental storytelling is really a much more emotionally impactful way than just laying out the text or with a large diatribe from a character, rather than telling you all about a fascist government, right? If you're wandering the streets and you're seeing guards at every corner and you're seeing patriotic displays everywhere, and then in the alleys you're seeing graffiti, right? You can tell that story of the fascist government and the resistance to it in a way that is more discovered and more emotionally impactful than if you just laid it out in a scroll in the beginning of the game. Yeah.
I I think you're absolutely right. And sometimes the scroll is helpful to kind of set a a lens through for people to look through. But what you're talking about, I think, is always the stronger way to do it, and leads to. Um, so I think we've probably had this conversation before. But one of the things I've been thinking a lot is that the games don't really happen on a console or a screen. Um, that they happen in here
Exactly.
at some important level. Um, the player is the game board, and there are effects interactive storytelling can achieve that other kinds of storytelling have a harder time getting to. And I'll give you a concrete example because that sounds very abstract, I know. But I remember talking to Alon again um, after he had played the console game The Last of Us for the first time.
Mhm.
And he was remarking on how you meet, I think it's Ellie, you don't know much about her and you don't know much about the world, but your job is more or less to keep her alive. And you, because you have to constantly think about guarding this teenage girl for hours and hours and hours and hours of gameplay, you end up going from stranger to being in loco parentis, right? You do become a father figure because you can't help it.
Right.
You haven't just read about it, you've lived the experience of, oh my God, what is she doing now? Where did she go? Like every parent has that. They were right here. um, what happened? Oh my God, I have to. So interactive to take a secondary example from something you and I worked on when we did the ARG for Gun, and we got the small favor in which one of the characters asked people to go out to a graveyard near them and find
Right.
someone, the grave of someone who died on the day they were born, and do something nice for it. It's a great example of moving the player's game board, because they were physically in a location where they were filled with their own sense of mortality. And I think what games can do that novels can't, and I obviously love a good novel. I've certainly written enough of them. Um, but they can bring so much more of the player's whole experience in. And when you've done that, you've done what this art form can is unmatched at.
Yeah, beautiful examples, and I think Last of Us, touching back to that for a second, right? A great example of kind of emergent storytelling, right? Just the way that the your relationship with the character evolves over time. A lot of that's in your own head, but that's what I used to call back when when graphics were nowhere near as good. I used to call the player as the infinite resolution renderer, right? Because it's your imagination brings things into incredible fidelity and a depth that is very hard to get through a screen. And that's ultimately, as you said, that's where you're designing for is those reactions inside the player's head. And that emergent narrative, again, doesn't always need to be vocalized, right? Doesn't need to be spoken or written. It can be part of that emergent part of that kind of environmental storytelling, right? If we go back to that example previously, if you're playing in that game and you're trying to overthrow that fascist government, um, yes, you could do that with like a score bar on the side, right? But that really doesn't have a lot of emotional impact, right? If instead, as you're wandering the streets, you start to see more graffiti, you start to see posters ripped down and posters graffitied over, right? You could provide your sense of accomplishment, your sense of progress through that much more emotionally, cognitive environment of the environment and the way the characters in the environment behave, right? If people are coming out of their house and more people are showing up at demonstrations, more people are you know, uh, willing to doing things that were would have put them at great risk, then you're able to get a more emotional kind of cognizant, more emotional, resonant feedback on your performance, on how you're playing.
Uh, yeah, could not agree more. So in the first ARG, one of the phrases that's always associated with it is "This is not a game," which is usually Elon gave a talk at GDC about the ways that we all tried to make things seem as real as possible. But the actual first person to say those words was me, and it was about something completely different. Because the and this actually has some bearing on our topic, thank God. Uh, the basic mechanic of an ARG was get a chunk of story, find a puzzle that would unlock the next chunk of story. A mechanic just like an RPG in a lot of ways. Um,
Yes.
but I was becoming frustrated by the fact that people were so focused on solving the puzzles, that was the conversation. And I wanted them to feel this the way they felt a novel or a movie. And so I set about to say, this is not a game, and write some story that was embedded, hopefully, in gameplay and in the world, but that you could not miss, that your response here as a player, first and foremost, was to feel it and to care about it. And that it might have implications for your actions later, but I really wanted that to happen. And I think when you talk about the exact thing you're describing, the graffiti and the gradual uprising of a resistance, that's feeling it in a way that a scoreboard or all those kinds of metrics are very cerebral. They're not heart things. And one of the things story can do, I mentioned earlier that sometimes you can give people agency in how rather than what. A big part of story is why. Why do I give a shit? Why does this matter? Why do I care? Um, and that's, I think, what story can contribute most profoundly is, how is this not just another set piece battle?
Love the why, and it reminds me of one of my favorite lines from Cavalier and Clay, the Michael Carbon book about the kind of beginning of the comics industry, where there's a writer and an artist, cousins, and are working on their own comic, and Batman comes out, and the writer is just like blown away, right? He's like, this changes everything, right? And the artist is like, I don't get it. Why does it change everything? And he says, because finally we have a superhero who's not about what he can do, but why he does it.
Yes.
And that one really struck me. It's like, yes, that's really true. And understanding the whys of our characters and our plots overall is really important, right? It just builds much more depth. I also want to go back to your example on the Beast, because one of the things that you did in the Beast that to me was incredibly resonant, was because it was 100% reflective, was the Red King. We had this minor character in our story. We thought he was a minor character, and he was an AI that loved nightmares, human nightmares. He was fascinated with human nightmares. And we wrote him as originally a relatively minor character. The players were really interested in him, and they started posting their own nightmares, right? And writing about their nightmares in the different chat rooms and so on for the game. And so we realized there was really something here. There were people reacting to it. So we decided to make him into a major character. And then you mined all of their nightmares, and every line of dialogue he said for the next 6 months was pulled from audience members' nightmares. And that was brilliant. And I mean, it's the ultimate kind of reflectivity.
It was yeah, there are two characters there. It's actually Loki. The Red King is the hacker who's the audience.
Oh, yeah. Okay, sorry. This is a problem of being old and having made too many things. You
Yeah,
mix them up.
You've made so many things. But no, you're right. And it was actually a class of thing I was going to bring up. That sometimes I call it quilting, which is let the players give you the squares and make something out of the material that they give you. And I think that's a great example of the sort of aggressive or emergent why, how. The players thought, oh, I don't know, maybe if we made a database of nightmares, something good would happen. And then, yes, I was reading through and trying to construct his dialogue, and enough so that on Isle of Bees, we had a character called the Sleeping Princess who and woke up And we set the rule set that the only words she had were words that people had written to her first, so that she could grow her vocabulary only at the rate that the players supplied it to her. Just thinking of a variation of the Loki thing that you just referenced. And I think that can be super, super powerful because people feel so seen. Um, and the plot might not branch, but the fact that it's your story about a thing that terrified you when you were 8 that the game is speaking back to, makes it feel
Right.
tremendously. Um,
Yeah, and admittedly, that some of that incredible levels of reflectivity are not possible in a packaged game as opposed to a live game like an ARG, but they are still possible, right? I mean, anything from, as you said, giving the coin to the to the beggar, or from literally having the person, having a person type answers to their questions, or as we move forward, people are talking to their games. You're going to be able to get more and more contextual information from them to be able to use, mine it, and then build content in reaction to it.
I think one of the things that, if you're talking about something you can do in live performance, um, very easily, uh, super hard and a prepackaged thing, but part of the promise of AI in either as characters you interact with directly or sort of behind the scenes watching your inputs and reflecting them dynamically is the ability to have that kind of feedback loop. And one of the bars for me whenever I'm working in anything like this is just try to make an in joke. You know how it is with you and your buddies, like something happens, someone says something funny, capture it and call it back later. um it's as dumb as, ask the player their favorite breakfast food, and, you know 5 levels later when they're in the dungeon and the guard comes in and says, "No granola for you."
Exactly. Exactly. I remember when we were working on Xbox, and the window engineer said, "Well, it has to have a hard drive," which was going to kill any profits the Xbox was going to make forever. And I was like, "All right, well, since we have to have a hard drive, what can we use it for?" Right? And this concept of generative gameplay, I started to really play with back then. It's 25 years ago now. And so one of the games I wanted to do was a horror game where you start on the psychiatrist's couch and you have that interview with, like, what are the things that scare you, right? And what are your nightmares about? And then try to build the levels procedurally from that. Yeah, that was way too aggressive for 2000, but but I think the concept is very much more feasible today to be able to react to that level. I want to talk a little bit about where narrative lives. I think it's often a misconception that narrative lives just in characters. But we've been talking about how it lives in environments. But I think it's really important to discuss that that it lives everywhere, right? That that you can bury and expose narrative gems that build this larger cognitive world view and plot view for the player underneath literally every rock, right? When they pick up a loot box and there's stuff in there, right? Well, each of those things, the lore of each of those things that they pick up, right, can add to that worldview. And I think some games have done this particularly well, where they have no, like, dialogue narrative at all, right? And all of their world view, all of the kind of narrative structure is through the discovery of these elements and both their appearance and their lore.
One of the things that makes me think, and of course I could hardly agree more, um, one of the ways you can tell good writing from bad writing, generally speaking, or let me put that differently, good writing from, you know, writing, um, uh, in generic writing, characters are identical to their plot function. So
Right.
I am the captain of the ship who will make a mistake. And my character is I am the captain of a ship who will make a mistake. Um, and better writing tends to be I am John McNamara, grew up on the Plymouth Run, back and forth to Ireland, graduated to the North Atlantic crossing, worked my ass off. I have one kid who's a bit of a loser, but I keep trying to set a good example, and I've just become captain of the Titanic. That guy, you feel it. It feels rounder. It feels more complete. Similarly, when you're in a game world, I know it didn't seem like I was responding in any way to what you were saying, but
Oh no, no, keep
you
going.
see where this is going. When a game is the execution of the mechanics, it feels like when a character is defined by its plot points. When you situate those mechanics in a world in which things are, medieval and Arabic, and that's everywhere, it feels so much richer and so much less like my energy bar is at 7. I've got to raise it to 9, so I need to get the weapon. Like it's a much richer experience when you can embed the story throughout. And when I was looking in the overview and I saw, talking a little bit about this, it is often fun. It may be a grace note or it may be just dumb and not worth it, but it's worth taking a moment of thinking just how far can we push this story. So, for example, I wrote a novel once in which I decided that I was going to have the story start before the first page. I was going to start the story with the dedication because you don't think of that as being part of the book. But I thought,
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to use the dedication page
Ah,
to set the lens that people read the book through. So the dedication for that book was for a spider I killed in Texas once and all my swallowed ghosts. So
well,
when you
beautiful.
read that before you get to page 1, you already know kind of the journey you're on. Um, and similarly, I don't know, do you know the Timur Bekmambetov movie Night Watch?
Yes.
So I don't know if you remember this, but it's stupid how impactful it is that the subtitles come in and go out like cigarette smoke.
Yes. I had not remembered it until you said it, but yes, yeah.
Um, and it just makes you feel like every other movie is made by someone lazy. This movie, like fucking the subtitle come in and then they bleed out like smoke. It's a grungy post-Soviet urban vampire movie. If you haven't seen it, batshit crazy, but like worth checking out anyway.
Yeah, beautiful example. Uh, and I'd love to. We're going to have you back and do a whole discussion of world building. But one aspect that I want to just mention that touches on what you were just talking about, which is the relationship between the character and the world, right? And from my perspective, and you may have a different one by all means. I start by identifying the kind of characters I want in my world, and then I design a world that would generate them.
100%.
Right?
I mean,
Um, because they have to have that connection. I always use the example of Conan walking down the streets of Manhattan as a great SNL skit, but it's not a long-term franchise, right? Because that world wouldn't have generated him. He wouldn't be a response, right? I think that heroes and villains are a response to the worlds they grow up in.
uh, it's so funny because that's eerily close to the example I used to make the exact same point, which is, um, lazy fantasy writing when you see uh, death with a hooded robe and a scythe in the streets of New York. Because that's pastiche. Those things are like, it's funny and you can do it for comedy, but it's not a serious version of death. It's,
Exactly. I mean, Terry Pratchett, after Terry Pratchett, you can, that's the master of death. But
right.
after that, you're done. But I
Uh,
do think entirely, yeah.
but the person who did the work is James Cameron, because the Terminator is exactly death, but death for the late 20th century, mechanized, urban. It's a beautiful example of doing the work and creating a harmony between the world and the character. And we as humans just care a lot about humans. So you can create a world and then incidentally populate it with people, but it is never going to be as compelling as doing it the other way around. Um,
Yeah, no, I agree. So yeah, we'll dive more into that in a whole world building one, which I would very excited to have a conversation with you about. Um, and well, it's I guess as we kind of move towards the end of this session, are there some points that you would like, new game designers, people, both coming to it from the game perspective and people coming from the writing perspective, right? Because one of the things I'm really excited about as we kind of open up the creative freedom for people who to make games, whether it's through all the different types of mediums coming, mechanisms coming available, is that we can see a lot more writers making games in addition to game designers and artists, musicians, audio designers making games. So, any advice from people coming from the two different points of view?
well, I have. I'll start with a pet peeve and see if it grows into anything. Um, One thing that is true in so here's a very extreme thesis about writing, um, which is actually the only thing that matters uh, in storytelling is uh, I sometimes think of it as the dance of the seven veils. You meet a
Huh?
character and then you take off one veil at a time. And honestly, that's all we care about. Oh, I got a little closer. Oh, I feel a little deeper. Oh, that the gradation of intimacy, in some senses, meeting a character is like, going on a date when you're 14 and just, am I going to hold this person's hand? Am I allowed? Where do I cross that barrier? Like that magical moment. And it's why something like Pride and Prejudice can be as much of a page turner as an action film. And I would argue often more so. And my pet peeve is when we have action set pieces whose point is to be an action set piece. It is, I will admit, because I am an author and I have this viewpoint, the fight scenes I care about are also characterization. Uh, and I would say for people interested in narrative and game, and it's in fact true when you start writing even novels, even linear things, you tend to do, here is a piece of setting, here is a piece of plot, here is a piece of character, next setting, next piece of plot, next character-based conversation. And what you learn is to crush all those things together so that everything is always character.
Right.
So if there is a way, a challenge I'd love to say to people, if character matters, if story matters in your game, don't think of that as something that stops when the fight scene starts, because
Yes.
then it's the difference between musicals where there's a bit of plot and then someone sings, and then there's a bit of plot, and then someone sings. In fact, you want it to all feel.
Yeah, which is the definition of the American musical, right? Which was the first format where the plot was advanced through singing, right? So yeah, I agree.
And some I I had a conversation once at a sci-fi con with someone who was sort of making the comparison between musicals and pornography, saying the way you know it's not porn is if something happens during the song. Uh, and similarly, it, I would just encourage people when they're thinking about narrative design and story engagement and character building to not have to let that character piece and the world piece, the story piece seep into the pickpocketing, the duel,
The action parts.
the action parts.
Yeah, yeah. Completely, beautifully said. Well, thank you for a stimulating conversation, and I look forward to having you back to talk about more aspects of this. If we can steal more of your time.
Love to.
All right. Well, thank you all for tuning in. I hope it had some useful tips, and we will look forward to talking again soon on the next edition of the Game Mechanics.
All right, I'll have my rag.